Boldwood presents Stormy Days on Mulberry Lane. Written by Rosie Clarke and read by Polly Edsel. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Peggy smiled as she felt her husband Abel move carefully from their bed. It was early on Sunday morning, June 1950, and they'd been back in London nearly 3 months now. She understood immediately why her beloved husband was getting up and trying not to wake her. It was only 5 o'clock, and she'd been up until nearly midnight the previous evening, serving and then clearing up in the pub to help her daughter-in-law Sheila, because Pip, her husband, was away on business. Rose Barton, who often helped out in the bar of the Pig and Whistle, hadn't been feeling too well. Her doctor had advised her to take things easy for a couple of weeks because her blood pressure had been slightly raised. "I'd love to help Sheila more," Rose had told Peggy when she was asked, "but Tom is so excited about this baby, and I daren't risk anything." Tom Barton was the local builder, handyman, and a good friend to them all. "He says I should sit at home and listen to the plays on the wireless." "Did you listen to the play the other night?" Peggy asked. "I missed it, but it was repeated the other night. It's good." "Yes, but I'd rather be in the pub with friends. I'm sure I'm fine to work." "You probably are," Peggy had agreed, smiling at her. She was, by her own reckoning, just 2 or 3 weeks more advanced in her pregnancy than Sheila, who was around 6 months. "But why risk anything when this baby means so much to you both?" "That's what Tom says." Rose had laughed and blushed. "He would smother me in cotton wool if he could, Peggy." "That's because he adores you," Peggy had reminded her, and Rose agreed. "Just be glad he cares so much, Rose, and don't worry about Sheila. I can help her, just as I always do when she needs it." Peggy smiled as she stretched and eased her limbs in bed, watching Abel dress. She hadn't minded doing her bit in the pub the previous evening, even though it meant leaving Abel to sit in with the twins. She'd found him dozing in his chair when she got home, the wireless on, and a book on the floor beside him. Waking, he'd smiled at her as she presented him with a cup of milky cocoa. Abel never grumbled, because he knew that taking Faye to the ice rink was why they were back in London, and Peggy was thriving on being at the heart of things again. Fortunately, despite her husband Pip's fears, Sheila was carrying her second baby well, much better than she had her first. She'd had a couple of faints earlier on in the pregnancy, but since Peggy had been back to tell her to rest and not do too much, taking on some of her workload, Sheila's health had picked up. Reflecting on the way her daughter-in-law was blooming, Peggy felt it was simply because she felt reassured by their presence. Sheila got on very well with Abel, who smiled at her in his soft, casual way, and his gentle, considerate manner towards her seemed to have rubbed off on Pip, who had become very attentive to his wife all of a sudden. In fact, it had been Pip who had asked his mother to keep an eye on Sheila that evening. "I wouldn't leave her if it wasn't really important, Mum, but it's work, and I can't get out of it. In fact, I ought to— well, that doesn't matter," he'd said, looking worried and concerned. "I know she's perfectly well. I can't stop thinking about her. If you hadn't been here, I couldn't have attended this conference." "You have to go. It's your work," Peggy had assured him. "Being a pub landlord isn't exactly your vocation, Pip. It's not your fault your wife's barman chose this particular fortnight to take his annual holiday. Besides, Sheila loves serving in the bar and so do I. So you don't have to persuade me to help out. I really enjoy it." "The pub ought to be yours," Pip had said, frowning. "I know you had the lease transferred to us in case I couldn't earn a living after my sight was affected during the war, but it's yours by right." "No, I don't want to run it full time," Peggy had replied firmly. "I have my boarding house, and that is starting to do very nicely. Helping out when I'm needed is a pleasure, and I'll always do that. But Sheila is the landlady now,
Yes, and she loves it, he agreed, smiling ruefully. I mustn't take that from her just because these days I could quite easily pay the bills without what she earns. But she can provide extras for the family and save some for the future, Peggy had pointed out. One day, your son might want to buy his own house or business and Sheila may have enough saved to help. Money is always useful, Pip, and it's a part of life to work. Sheila doesn't come from the leisure classes, and she would get bored if all she had to do was run an home. Just like you, Mum. Pip had pulled a wry face. Do you think that's why I fell in love with her? Don't they say men fall in love with younger versions of their mothers? Peggy had laughed at him. Idiot. Sheila might like some things I do, such as cooking and running a pub, but in other ways, she's very different. I think Chris got his musical talent from her. It certainly didn't come from me or your father. Pip shook his head. These days he didn't like to speak about his father at all. At first, he'd resented his mother's second husband, Abel, taking his father's place in Peggy's heart and bed. But since talking long distance on the phone to his sister Janet a few times more recently, he seemed to have become a bit resentful of his late father. No, definitely from Sheila's side, he'd agreed decisively. Her great-uncle Sam was a musician. Chris hasn't inherited anything from my father, thank God. Their conversation had ended then, leaving Peggy to raise an eyebrow. Laurie Ashley had been far from the perfect husband, his infidelity frequent in the last years before his death, but he'd been a good father to Pip, and she would rather he didn't become bitter towards him. He should have good memories. He hadn't treated Peggy well, but Pip had no reason to resent him. Becoming aware that Abel was looking at her, Peggy smiled. I'm sorry if I woke you, hon, her lovely husband said with a smile that made her heart leap for joy. I promised to take Faye in for an early skating session. It starts at 6:30, but the traffic is less at this hour. It takes quite a while to get to the Empress Hall in Earl's Court. That is where she's booked today, isn't it? Yes. She is practicing there for the moment because they will be holding the amateur championships there, and she needs to get used to the rink for when her turn comes to be entered. But it's quite a way, so I like to book the early session for her whenever possible. Abel was fully supporting his 10-year-old daughter's ambitions to be a successful ice skater. Faye had a natural ability, and with regular tuition, was improving all the time. Yes, I know, Peggy said, and smiled. I think I'm nearly ready to get up. I'll get dressed and come down for a cup of tea. All right, I'll put the kettle on. One of the first things Abel had done when arriving at the boarding house was to install a splendid gas cooker. There was already a beautiful range that Peggy liked using for her cooking, but Abel thought it was easier to heat a gas ring for the kettle, and when he cooked, he used the gas oven. Peggy didn't mind that. In fact, it suited her. If Abel wanted to make pancakes, it didn't interfere with anything she was making, and she never felt he was invading her kitchen, which she might have had he wanted to use her range. Cooking was one of the vital things in Peggy's life. She'd always done it, and during the war it had become like a game of chess. The battle to find enough ingredients to make food taste good had been never-ending. However, she'd always been lucky, and some of her many friends had supplied her with lots of extras from their allotments. Abel wasn't much of a vegetable gardener, but Peggy had many friends in the lanes around her home and the pub, which was the centre of the district, and most of them had allotments. So, even during the war, she'd often had boxes of veg straight from a friend's allotment. They still remembered the shortages during the war, though most food was readily available now. Flour had been de-rationed a while ago. Petrol had come out of rationing in May that year. Also canned and dried fruit, syrup, treacle, jellies, mincemeat, and some other things. Soap was still rationed, as was sugar and various other foodstuffs. It still wasn't easy to find some of the spices that made food that little bit special, but Peggy was adaptable, and she often sought out small grocery shops run by people from different ethnic groups, like Indian, Greek,
Italian and Jewish, which had begun to open up in the little lanes and side streets again. Mentally, she reviewed the little packets and jars on her pantry shelves. Masala, paprika, turmeric, star anise, ginger, cayenne pepper, cumin, a mix of Chinese spices that were a mystery to her but made food taste wonderful, and so many herbs, both dried and fresh. Many of her friends wouldn't even think of entering the shop she visited, but she'd found lots of different things on their shelves, and they were always so friendly, always willing to explain to her what the different pastes and sauces were used for, and, importantly, how much to use. Peggy always erred on the side of caution. She could add more of a new powder, but put too much in and it might be too hot to eat, or simply too strong. Subtle flavours were always best, she felt, and she sometimes mixed a little of this and that just for fun, but tasting all the time, because food was too precious to waste. Peggy smiled as she thought of the look on people's faces when they tasted her soups and casseroles. The amazement when they encountered flavours they'd never known before, and the way their eyes lit up. She'd always liked to experiment, and during the war her imagination had had to stretch to find food worth serving in the Pig and Whistle, but she'd always loved to cook, and could turn her hand to anything. Being married to Abel and running the cafe at the seaside for a few years after the war had made her even more adventurous, because her husband's love of certain American foods had opened her eyes to new combinations and flavours. She was smiling in contentment as she went down to the kitchen. There was plenty of time to have a cup of tea with Abel before he took the twins off to the ice rink. They would eat brunch when they returned, though Abel and Freddie were already munching a piece of toast and marmalade when she joined them. Peggy drank her tea and ate her toast. Abel never let the fact that he was missing a part of his left arm stop him doing anything, and he had made tea for her and coffee for himself. He was still able to buy the coffee he liked from American military friends, and he drank it most of the time, but never minded making tea for her in the morning. She sent him a look filled with love, wondering again just what she'd done to deserve such a wonderful husband. "You can manage the breakfasts for the guests alone?" Abel asked, a slightly anxious note in his voice as he looked at her. He was feeling guilty at leaving the work to her, though he was doing what she'd asked, taking the twins to their early session. Freddie was learning to play ice hockey, while Faye concentrated on figure skating, so they were company for each other. But even so, Peggy didn't like them travelling alone too early in the morning or too late in the evening. She often let them catch the bus together, just the two of them, but not early, and not late. "We have 4 gentlemen and 1 lady at the moment," Peggy said, smiling at him. "And you know Alice loves to set the tables for me and help me clear. She'd do far more if I'd let her." Alice was a friend she'd known for years, and on Peggy's return to the lane, she had invited the elderly lady to live with them, because she was finding it hard to manage alone. Peggy wasn't sure of her friend's age, but she must be well into her 70s by now, though she didn't let that slow her down or stop her helping Peggy out when she could. "I know, hun." Abel bent to kiss her on the mouth. His kiss was soft, yet lingered, telling her that he loved her. He winked, and then turned to the twins. "Come on, you terrible pair. Let's get going and give your mom some peace." "Bye, Mum," Faye said, already impatient to be gone. "Don't work too hard, Mum," Freddie said, and gave her a quick hug. "I'll wash up when I get back." "Thank you, darling. Have a wonderful time." Peggy smiled as they left with a flurry of noise and laughter. She had no intention of leaving washing up for her son to do on his return, though he would have gladly done it. Her energy levels were building now that she'd had her pot of tea and her toast. She would start setting the trays for her guests, and then, when they came down in about another hour and a half, she would cook the fried breakfast they all loved on Sunday mornings. First of all, she would start her baking. "I thought I heard you." Alice's voice came from the doorway, and Peggy turned to greet her with a smile. "I know it's too early for breakfast, but I thought I might help you." "I'll make a cup of tea," Peggy said. "You can have your breakfast here in the kitchen with me if you like."
Oh, yes, I'd love that, Alice said, and her lined face lit with pleasure. The twins get off all right to their skating? Yes. I hope they didn't wake you, Alice. No, I never sleep late in the mornings these days, Alice said, until you invited me to live here with you, Peggy. I hardly slept at all. But I feel so much safer here. Your bed is so comfortable and... She gave Peggy an oddly shy smile for such a normally confident woman. You make me feel like a part of your family. You are part of my family, Peggy said. The twins love you. They've adopted you as their granny, and we all enjoy having you here with us. Peggy had invited Alice to be a permanent guest at the boarding house because she'd known her friend of many years was finding it hard to make her small pension last the week. She would have taken her in for free, but Alice insisted on paying 5 shillings a week towards her food, and she also helped wherever she could in the house. Light dusting, picking up discarded newspapers, or setting and clearing tables in the dining room was a big help, and Peggy considered that she had the best of the bargain. I should be paying you, she'd told Alice when she'd been given the 5 shillings the previous day. You helped me so much, dearest Alice. I couldn't accept your generosity then, Alice had told her. 5 shillings is less than I used to pay for rent. It leaves me plenty for anything I want, and I don't have to worry how to pay my coal bill. To save her friend's pride, Peggy had taken the 5 shillings and spent it on extra food. There was always a cup of tea for Alice when she wanted it, and the elderly lady was very partial to Abel's pancakes. In fact, when asked what she would like for breakfast, she opted for pancakes with maple syrup and a squeeze of lemon, rather than the bacon, egg, fried bread and tomatoes the other guests would all expect and enjoy. I think I'll have one with you, Peggy said, and added the various ingredients into Abel's mixer, whisking up the mixture to the consistency Abel had shown her long ago. She made a small pile of pancakes, keeping them warm in the top of the oven, before carrying them to the table. Alice had set their places, with little mats and knives and forks, and they sat down together to eat their way through the sweet treat. After they'd eaten and washed the delicious food down with a pot of Abel's favourite coffee for a change, Peggy washed up and Alice dried. They chatted together as old friends, about Peggy's daughter Janet, now living in Scotland, and Sheila's health. It was better than they'd thought it might be, considering how ill she'd been with her first pregnancy, which was the reason Pitt worried over her, perhaps unnecessarily this time around. Alice then sat and watched Peggy whisk up a coffee cake and 2 tins of almond-flavoured buns. The guests all loved Peggy's cakes, and most asked for afternoon tea every day once they'd tasted them. They might book for bed, breakfast with the option of tea, and an evening meal. But once they tasted her food, they all wanted the extras. When the cakes were in the oven, Alice picked up 2 of the trays Peggy had prepared earlier and carried them through to the dining room. Peggy followed with the second 2 and placed them on the gleaming oak sideboard just as the first guest arrived. Good morning, Mrs. Ronoscki, a middle-aged gentleman said. Good morning, Alice. How are you both? I'm very well, Mr. Bonnet, Alice said and smiled at him. I had my breakfast early in the kitchen with Peggy. I had pancakes, and they were delicious, so I shan't be joining you this morning. Perhaps you would share my coffee, he beamed at her. I do so enjoy your company in the mornings. Well, I could if you wish. I'll bring coffee for 2, Peggy said with a look of approval. He was such a nice man and so kind to Alice. I'm very well too, Mr. Bonnet. Shall I bring you the full English this morning as usual? Yes, please, he said, and selected one of the trays. Each tray had half a fresh grapefruit that morning, with a little cherry on top. Also, a sugar shaker. Peggy's homemade lime and orange marmalade in a little dish, 2 pats of butter, a small plate, a cup and saucer, knife, fork, and 2 spoons.
plus a clean white napkin. The cooked breakfast and a pot of coffee would be brought in by Peggy, followed later by hot toast.
This looks delightful, as always.
Peggy nodded and went away to start cooking the breakfasts. She could already hear the other guests making their way down the stairs, and so she would cook all the bacon and fried bread at the same time. Most of the gentlemen liked their eggs fried in different ways, and Mr. Simpson liked his scrambled instead. She prepared the sausage, bacon, and bread for frying first, and then made Mr. Bonnet's coffee. While that was brewing, she cooked his egg and tomato and then carried the heavy tray into the dining room. All the guests were seated, and 2 had eaten their grapefruit already.
Scrambled egg rather than fried, Mr. Simpson? She asked.
Yes, please, Peggy, he replied. Mr. Simpson had been coming to the Lane since before the war, and knew her from the pub, so felt entitled to call her Peggy.
If it is no trouble.
None at all, she said, and looked at the 2 men sitting together.
Mr. Jones and Mr. Craven, do you both wish for the full English this morning?
Yes, please, Mrs. Ronoscki, they answered in chorus.
And lots of toast afterwards. I'm starving,
Mr. Jones added with a grin.
Would you like an extra slice of bacon, sir? Or a sausage?
Peggy asked.
Yes, an extra slice of bacon, please, if you can spare it,
he said.
Yes, I can do that,
Peggy said, smiling at Alice, who had made it possible by choosing pancakes instead.
What about you, Mr. Craven? Mr. Simpson?
Not for me, thank you. I enjoy the grapefruit and the toast so much. I could eat more of that, but I'd best watch my waistline, or your delicious cooking will make me fat. Mr. Craven smiled at her.
I'd prefer an extra tomato,
Mr. Simpson replied.
I always find your breakfast quite substantial, but plenty of toast, please. I particularly like this marmalade. I've never tasted any quite like it.
Peggy makes it herself, Alice said, and received a nod from him. Peggy went off to finish the cooked breakfasts and then make the toast. Her buns were ready, so she took them out of the oven to cool. The coffee cake needed another couple of minutes or so. She finished cooking the eggs and tomatoes, added them to the perfectly presented bacon and fried bread, and carried them through to the dining room. There she removed Mr. Bonnet's empty breakfast plate, taking it back to the kitchen and placing it in the sink to soak while she took out the cake and then set about making piles of fresh toast. Mr. Bonnet was given the first rack with 4 slices cut in halves. Mr. Simpson had a rack of 6 slices, and Mr. Jones and Mr. Craven had a rack of 6 slices, again neatly cut in halves. Peggy paused at Mr. Bonnet's table.
Is there enough toast for you? She asked. I can bring more if you wish.
He smiled at her.
No, thank you, Peggy. I'm going out to lunch with a friend today, and if I eat more than this, I shan't eat my meal. But that was delicious, every scrap of it.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. More coffee?
No, thank you. Unless Alice would like some.
Alice shook her head.
No, thank you, Peggy. I'll bring some plates through for you in a moment.
Peggy shook her head.
Sit and talk to Mr. Bonnet for a bit longer. You can help me later.
Returning to the kitchen with the used breakfast plates, Peggy reflected that no one had left anything, even though she'd given the hungry ones extra fried bread, tomatoes, or eggs. She knew that the toast racks would be cleared, and in 10 minutes she would ask if anyone needed more toast, tea, or coffee. The used dishes were washed and left to drain. She dried her hands and returned to the dining room. Everyone but Mr. Bonnet and Alice had gone. Peggy smiled at them and cleared the tables. Mr. Bonnet was a salesman and had already told her that he would be staying with her whenever he was in the area. At the moment, he was working in London, but sometimes he was sent up north to Manchester and would be away for up to 6 weeks at a time, occasionally longer. Peggy cleared the other 2 tables and returned to the kitchen. She'd washed the dishes when Alice brought in the things from Mr. Bonnet's table. She brought them to the sink and then wiped the dishes and plates Peggy had washed earlier, arranging them carefully on the large oak dresser.
"Mr. Bonnet is very pleasant, isn't he?"
Peggy said.
"Oh, yes, lovely. Just the sort of gentleman I like,"
Alice replied with a smile of contentment.
"I shall miss him when he goes off on his travels."
"Has he said when he intends to leave?"
"Yes, next Monday. He is going on a tour of Manchester and various big cities up north,"
Alice said.
"He sells industrial fittings and fixtures and lots of boring stuff for his firm. It pays a decent wage, and he has managed to save a bit."
She smiled.
"He's a bit like I would have wanted my son to be."
Alice looked wistful because her children had died in infancy. "He seems fond of you, Alice."
"He is kind and generous."
Alice hesitated.
"His daughter wants him to buy a little cottage near her in Newmarket, but he doesn't fancy that much."
She smiled a little oddly.
"He told me he thinks I'm lucky to live here all the time."
She hesitated then.
"Would you take him on as a permanent lodger, if he asked?"
"Yes, of course I would," Peggy said. "But you mustn't get your hopes up, Alice. He might not want that."
"Oh, I think he would," Alice said confidently. "He told me this morning that he was considering asking you to keep his room while he's away. He knows he will have to pay the full amount because you need to fill your rooms."
"Well, we're not always full," Peggy said. "We've got bookings for next month for every room, but I didn't know when he would be leaving on one of his trips, so I kept that room free."
"Oh, he will be pleased," Alice replied, looking delighted. "He was afraid you might have let it, as he told you he might be away next month."
"Yes, but I wasn't sure." Peggy fetched her register from the dresser drawer.
"No, I haven't taken a booking for Mr. Bonnet's room at all. It is completely free." "Then I shall tell him he can have it on a permanent basis, shall I?"
"Well, I suppose, yes. Of course he can have it," Peggy said. "I'll ask Abel and we'll come to some arrangement about the weeks he isn't here, so that he pays a little less when he isn't eating here." Alice nodded and smiled. Clearly she was pleased that her friend would continue to be a guest. Peggy knew Abel would accept whatever she decided upon, though they did need their guests to be paying guests. Peggy's involvement in the cake shop with Sheila and Maureen earned a little, but they were not yet earning anywhere near as much from the boarding house as they had from the cafe. Abel said it didn't matter. He had ideas for other businesses, he'd told her, though as yet he was keeping them close to his chest. She knew, of course, that he had the house in Mulberry Lane that he let out, which brought in a small income, but what else could he be planning? Chapter 2. Maureen Hart looked across the breakfast table at her husband Gordon, 2 small sons, and her stepdaughter Shirley. They had all eaten every scrap of their breakfasts, though the small boys had much smaller portions than the adults, of course. Bacon, scrambled egg, mushrooms, tomatoes, and fried bread was their Sunday treat now that these foodstuffs were more readily available, and they all enjoyed it together, relishing the fact that no one had to leave for work or school. "What are you planning for today, love?" Maureen asked the girl she thought of as her daughter. "It looks like being lovely." "I'm meeting Claire, and we're going to catch the bus to town, spend some time in the park, and perhaps go window shopping." She smiled at her mother. "Neither of us can afford the West End prices, but we like to look at the new fashions, Mum." "Yes, of course you do," Maureen said. "I'll give you a bit extra if there's something you actually want, Shirley." "No, I wouldn't pay the price they ask in Selfridges or Peter Robinson," Shirley said, laughing.
we're planning on getting ideas, and then we'll buy new patterns from Bowicks and make ourselves a new dress each. Claire wants a dress with a little bolero jacket and maybe a sweetheart neckline. We've seen the paper patterns, but we want ideas about what is new in the shops." Maureen nodded. Her daughter seemed so grown up these days, though only 17. Recently, Shirley had spent more time with her friend Claire, and they used Claire's mother's sewing machine to make clothes for themselves. Claire was leaving school that summer to take a course in typing and shorthand. She'd already been offered a job in the office of a large department store, and her mother was paying for her to take the course to improve her skills. Shirley, of course, was going on to college, after her summer holiday at the coast with Richard Kent, the son of their next-door neighbour, and her special friend. It was to be a working holiday during the months of July and August, after which she would return home for a week or two to get ready for medical school. Her long-held dream of being a doctor was coming closer at last. It was natural that she should want some new and fashionable clothes, and Maureen went to her purse in the dresser drawer and drew out £5. "Here, take this," she said. "I know you'll need things for your holiday, and you can't make them all. Besides, you want one really pretty dress bought from a shop. I'll give you some more when you go away, but take this now and spend it." Shirley looked at the money hesitantly. £5 was rather a lot of money for her mother to give her all at once, and she shook her head, clearly reluctant to accept it. "You work hard for that money, Mum," she said. "It's too much." "Shirley, you help me so much," Maureen said, and smiled at her. "I couldn't work with Sheila and Peggy, either cooking or in the cake shop, if you just went off all the time and left me to do all the housework. And you're so good with the boys. You deserve this and more. And there will be extra when you go on holiday, from me as well as your dad." "Thanks, Mum." Shirley threw her arms about her and hugged her. "I'm so lucky. Claire has to work in her uncle's grocery shop, stacking tins and boxing up orders on Saturdays to earn her 5 shillings a week pocket money. You spoil me, but thank you so much." "If I do, you're worth it," Maureen told her with a look of love. "You can tell me what the new styles are when you get back. I might make a new summer dress for myself." "You will buy yourself 3 new dresses for our holiday next month," Gordon told Maureen, looking up from his newspaper. "I'll pay for 'em, and I'll be giving Shirley £10 for whatever she needs when she goes on her working holiday." "Dad!" Shirley looked shocked. "I shall be earning money for those 2 months. Richard said the student nurses and doctors all try to get seasonal work during the summer break from medical school. It helps to keep them going in term time." "And that is what you will do with your wages," her father said. "Don't think it is all for spending, Shirley. You will need money once you start your proper training. I shall make you a small weekly allowance, of course, but anything you earn will make life easier for you while you learn to be a doctor. It will be a couple of years at least before you're on the wards and starting to earn anything." Shirley nodded. She'd told her mother that Claire was going on a 5-week course, and at the end of that time she would earn £1.10 a week, rising to £2.15 in 6 monthly intervals. There would be years of study before Shirley earned anything like that much. But of course, she could be paid far more than her friend if she made the grade and actually became a doctor, as she hoped. Maureen saw the smile on her daughter's face and felt happy for her. To be given £15 spending money by her parents was a surprise and hugely exciting, and meant she would be able to buy at least one good dress and the material for several others, as well as having a little store to take with her. Maureen was already making her a pretty yellow cardigan and a jumper to take with her to college in the autumn,
but it was always nice to have money of your own to spend, something that had been a rare occurrence in Maureen's own life when she was Shirley's age. After Maureen's mother had died, her father had treated Maureen more as a paid servant than his daughter for years, giving her a meagre wage for running and working all hours in their corner shop and dominating her life. That was never going to happen to Shirley. Gordon thought the world of her, and so did Maureen. She smiled as she started to clear away the breakfast dishes, waving away Shirley's offer of help. "You get off and meet Claire," she told her. "I'm going to do this and a bit of ironing. We'll have a cold lunch, and then your father and I are taking the boys to the church sports day this afternoon." Rose Barton cleared the breakfast table and dumped the dirty dishes in the sink. Jenny was laughing with her father and her little brother Jackie as he played games with them in the back garden. Thank goodness it was a lovely day, and they were out from under her feet for a while. She wasn't sure she could cope with her daughter screaming in her ear this morning. She was feeling tired and drained, sometimes a little dizzy, and that worried her, because she hadn't felt like that with either of her other pregnancies, and it made her worry that something was wrong. Tom was looking forward to another child in the house, and he would be devastated if anything happened to the baby, or indeed to her. No, that was morbid. Rose blocked the thought and looked out at the small patch of lawn at the back of the house. Tom had taken this particular house in Mulberry Lane because it had a garden, and not just a backyard. He played games on the lawn with the children on Sundays when he was home from work in his busy building yard, and grew fresh vegetables in the garden too. Many of the men in the lane had their allotments and gathered far more produce than they needed. Her husband grew just what he needed for his family, though he gave any surplus to his elderly neighbours. Tom was well liked in the district, and for good reason. His trade was as a builder or odd job man, though these days his projects were more ambitious. He employed a good worker who was both a bricklayer and a carpenter, and, being Tom, he'd soon taught himself to do both. He was becoming much sought after, and not just in the lanes about his home. The thing about her husband, Rose reflected as she paused to watch him catch his son in his arms and swing him high, was that he was always reliable. He did what he promised, and he did it well. And for elderly friends and neighbours, these days he often refused payment for small jobs. She smiled as she remembered his many kindnesses to Alice. She thought the world of Tom, and often wandered into Rose's kitchen of a morning to tell her about when he was growing up, leaving Rose in no doubt that her husband had had a hard childhood. He'd been treated harshly by his mother and lost his younger brother, who'd had a nose for trouble and got himself blown up during the war, something Tom's mother had blamed on him, despite Tom having done all he could to keep his brother from the bomb sites. Rose knew he was fond of his father, though they didn't see him often enough. After the war, Tom's father, Jack Barton, had stayed on in the army, married again, and was now living on the south coast in a small seaside village. He had scraped together enough to open a little grocery shop, which he ran with his wife, and he phoned his son regularly once a week on a Sunday evening. Jack Barton had invited them all to go and stay this summer, but Rose hadn't really felt like facing the journey, though it would be nice to have a little holiday at the sea with Tom's father. Jack's second wife was a friendly woman and would make them welcome. Perhaps she would think about it when the school holidays started. Jenny went to school now. She'd started by joining a preparatory group for a few mornings a week, but then she'd been taken on at the local infant school, and it gave Rose a little more time to get on with her work, because Jackie was far less trouble than her daughter. He would settle quietly with Alice if she was helping in Sheila's cake shop in the afternoon, and often just played with his toys while she worked in the house. Jenny was always following her about when she was home, demanding attention, but Jackie was far easier to please. However, these past few days, Rose had not felt inclined to do much apart from the necessary jobs about the house. She hadn't felt like this with her other babies, and it did bother her, though her doctor said she was fine, and it was natural not to want to do as much in her condition. She sighed, smothering her silly fears, and put the kettle on. In a few minutes, she would call Tom in for a cup of tea. They were having a salad lunch that day so that they could take the children to London Zoo in the afternoon. Maureen popped round to Rose's house that evening with the little white cardigan she'd knitted for the new baby. Rose invited her in and offered a cup of tea, but she shook her head. "No, thanks, Rose, love," she said, looking at her in concern because she looked a bit peaky. "I just wanted to bring you this and see how you were. Peggy told me you weren't feeling up to helping Sheila the other night, and I was a bit worried about you."
"It's just the baby," Rose replied, patting her bulge. "You know how it is when you begin to feel like a mountain, Maureen. I feel ungainly, and my back starts to ache if I stand too long."
Maureen nodded sympathetically. "I know just how you feel," she said, and smiled. "It will pass. You have got bigger this time, I think."
"I know," Rose groaned. "You don't think it's twins, do you?"
"What does the doctor say?"
"Nothing helpful," Rose replied with a rueful expression. "I'll be glad when your Shirley is a doctor, Maureen. We could do with a female doctor round here. The nurses are more help than Dr. Morton."
"Is that who you see?" Maureen nodded. "I'm not keen on him either. I always ask for Dr. Heath. He's younger and not as set in his ways. He was wonderful with Gordy when I took him last time, and Matty loves him."
"I've seen him in and around the surgery, but I haven't been to him," Rose said.
She blushed and stroked her tummy.
"I suppose I stick to Dr. Morton because he's old enough to be my father, and I find it embarrassing to be examined by younger men."
"Well, there is that," Maureen agreed. "I went to a special clinic when I needed to talk about something embarrassing once, and there was a woman doctor there. They are about, Rose, but we just haven't got one here yet."
"Do you think your Shirley will come back here to practice?" Rose asked. "She's a lovely girl, Maureen. You must be very proud of her."
"We are," Maureen agreed with a fond smile. "We both think the world of Shirley. I shall miss her when she goes away next month."
"Oh, yes. She's going on a working holiday before she goes to medical school, isn't she?"
"Yes. She wanted to go with her friend Richard and some of his colleagues. I think there are a couple of young women and Richard and perhaps another young student doctor going."
"Well, it will be an experience for her."
Maureen nodded. They chatted for another few minutes and then she left. Rose was certainly looking tired. She wondered if she ought to have a word with Tom about her, but then decided Rose might think she was interfering, and that was the last thing she wanted to do. Tom was almost like a younger brother to her, and she knew how much he adored Rose, but he was probably well aware that his wife was a little down at the moment and would be keeping an eye out for her. Glancing at the wristwatch Gordon had recently bought her, Maureen decided that she would just pop in and have a few words with Peggy before she went home. It was so good having her best friend back in the lanes, and she was smiling as she went round to the back door of the boarding house. Chapter 3.
"Well, Mrs. Ronoscki, it has been a delightful stay,"
Mr. Craven said as he paid his bill that Tuesday morning.
"I am sorry to be leaving."
"It was a pleasure to have you as our guest," Peggy told him with a smile. "I'm glad you enjoyed your stay here." He hesitated then.
"Would it be possible to buy a pot of that marmalade?" he asked her. "I enjoyed it so much and would like to continue eating it. You don't sell it, I suppose?"
"I hadn't considered it," Peggy said thoughtfully. "I should be happy to give you a small jar, sir. Just one moment." She went back into the kitchen and returned to him with an unopened jar. "There you are, Mr. Craven. I'm about to make another batch, so you can have the last of the previous one."
"You must let me pay you."
He looked at her oddly, almost as if testing her.
I don't know what you would consider fair.
Certainly not, Peggy told him. I'm quite happy to give it to you. Just tell your friends about it, sir. We haven't been going long, and although we're already busy, we can do with recommendations.
I most certainly will, he said, and popped the jar into his briefcase. Good morning, then. I'll be on my way, and thank you for the marmalade.
Peggy watched him leave, and then turned as Abel entered the hall.
What are you looking so pensive about?
He asked with a lift of his dark brows. Mr. Craven asked if he could buy a jar of my marmalade. I gave him the last one, so I'll have to visit the market and buy more oranges and limes. Abel frowned, glancing towards the door.
That's a bit odd. I shouldn't have thought that he would want a jar of marmalade when he works for a firm that makes all kinds of jams. I would imagine he gets all he needs as free samples.
He remarked on it a couple of times at breakfast, Peggy said. At least, I think he did. He certainly ate a lot of toast and marmalade.
Well, your jams are far better than most you can buy commercially, her husband said with a grin.
It is an idea, I suppose, Abel. I could make a few extra batches to sell. Maureen would put it in her grocery shop, or it could sell in the cake shop.
It would make a lot of extra work for you, hon, Abel said. I'm sure it would sell, but you have enough to do now. What with the boarding house and the cakes for Sheila's shop.
They still spoke of it as Sheila's, even though Peggy had been given a third share in the business, informally as there were no contracts drawn up between the three friends. It had started out as Sheila's idea, and then she'd asked Maureen to help her with the baking, and once Peggy returned to the lane, of course she was welcomed into the mix. They'd agreed to just bank any excess money, take out what was needed to pay expenses, and if they made a profit in 6 months' time, decide what to do with it then. None of them needed the money desperately, because the cake shop was run more for friendship and pleasure than profit. Yes, you're quite right, Peggy said decisively. I don't want to be tied to something that takes too much time, and I'd have to apply for more sugar to use commercially. Sugar was still on ration. Peggy had to ask for extra coupons for her boarding house guests, just as Sheila did for her business in the cake shop. Jam making used a lot of sugar, and although she might have considered preparing a batch of her special jam and marmalade for resale if sugar wasn't being rationed, it would be too difficult to get enough at the moment. She did get some extra because of the guest house, and Alice gave her all hers because she didn't take it in tea, only in coffee. Abel's American contacts in the military also supplied him with some very nice brown sugar, now and then, as well as the coffee he liked and various other tinned goods, not generally available. Peggy frowned as she remembered Mr. Craven's curiosity about the marmalade. He couldn't have been an inspector from the food ministry, could he? During the war, there had been a lot of black market racketeering going on, and the punishment for conviction had been quite severe at times. A butcher accused of selling stolen meat had gone to prison for some years. A cold chill went down her spine as she wondered if she'd been overgenerous with her sugar or the marmalade. No one could prove she'd done anything wrong, but if she was accused, it would be difficult and expensive to prove her innocence, though an occasional extra bag of sugar from a friend was surely not a huge crime. "What's wrong, hon?" Abel asked as he followed her into the kitchen. He was always so sensitive to her moods, and she told him what had crossed her mind. "If Mr. Craven is a secret inspector, he could cause trouble for us."
"No, I don't think so. We've never bought big off the black market, and we could have, had we wished to," Abel said. "A few items from friends of mine wouldn't stand up in court. They're gifts, and nothing to do with anything underhand."
"He wouldn't know that." Peggy shook her head. "No, I'm being foolish. The restrictions are nothing like as harsh as they were during the war, and I'm just letting my imagination run away with me, Abel. Mr. Craven simply wanted a pot of marmalade to take back with him."
"Of course he did," Abel said. "Who wouldn't?" His smile warmed her, banishing the doubts. If the restrictions were finally over, I think it would be worthwhile opening your own little shop to sell the lovely food you make, Peggy. But as it is, you couldn't get enough of what you need to make it in sufficient volume. I'm sure the commercial companies don't put in anywhere near as much of the good things you do.
No, perhaps not, Peggy agreed. Well, how did Faye's session go this morning? Did she get to school on time? Abel had got up early again to take his daughter to the ice rink for an extra lesson with her coach. Faye was making big strides with her skating, and they were talking about entering her in a beginner's competition later that year. Both Peggy and Abel thought it far too soon, but Sarah Anderson, her coach, thought it would be good for her to see what she was up against. Faye is an excellent skater for someone who has never done it before, she'd told Peggy the last time she'd accompanied her to the rink. However, there is a vast difference between being naturally good at something and achieving the perfection needed to win competitions. Yes, I'm quite certain there is. Peggy had agreed and frowned. Are you telling me that you've revised your first opinion of her ability? Faye had taken to the sport with enthusiasm, and her parents had been led to believe she had considerable talent. It was one of the reasons they'd moved back to London, to allow her sufficient time on the ice to practice. No, not at all, Sarah Anderson had assured her. I still believe that one day Faye might represent her country in the World Championships, but not for many years and only if she works hard all the time. Peggy had nodded. She understood what Sarah was telling her. Faye was enthusiastic, but she believed she was good already, and was perhaps not willing to put in as much hard work as she needed. It was what Janet, Faye's half-sister, had warned of when the subject first came up. You know what Faye's like, Mum, Janet had said. She's mad to try something at first, and then she gets bored and wants something else. Peggy had known her eldest daughter was talking sense, but she'd thought Faye's passion for skating meant more to her than that. It was just as well it hadn't been the main reason for her return to London. However, when she'd asked Faye if she was getting bored with her skating, she'd shaken her head. I love it, Mum, but Mrs. Anderson won't let me do all the things I want to try. She says I'm not strong enough in the ankles to do some of the jumps yet, and makes me keep doing exercises when I want to free skate. Well, Sarah did warn you it wasn't all glamour, Peggy had told her. I'm sure she will teach you the jumps when she thinks you're able to do them safely. The mutinous look in Faye's eyes had shown Peggy that she didn't agree, but she hadn't argued. Faye knew that if she argued with her mother or was rude to her, her father would curtail her pleasures. Abel doted on the twins, but easygoing as he was, he expected them to be polite to their mother and to do as Peggy asked. Freddie was always ready to please, but Faye could be an awkward little monkey when she chose. I think she got on well, Abel said, replying to Peggy's question. She has 1 or 2 new moves she is practicing. Sarah seemed pleased anyway. I think that competition is on in September or October. She'll want a new outfit for that, Peggy said and frowned. They had spent quite a lot of money on the move, and Faye's equipment was never cheap, but Abel never refused the twins anything. She wondered if he'd used more of his savings than he'd expected. We're a bit slow the rest of this month, Abel, but we shall be full up the whole of July and August. We have several families coming up for the summer holidays. Having lived most of her life in London, a holiday for Peggy was a trip to the sea or the country. But she discovered that quite a few families enjoyed coming to London for a week or two to take their children to see all the famous sights and the museums. Pip had told her that at the start, when she'd believed her main customers would be travelling salespeople. So far, most of her guests had indeed been salesmen on their rounds, but it would be pleasant to have the holiday guests in July and August, and she knew Alice was looking forward to it. Alice always loved having children around. You're not worrying about money, Abel smiled and drew her into his arms. I've hardly touched my savings, hon.
and I've got plans to increase our income. I'm just not sure which way to go for the best."
He frowned as he fished in his pocket for a small paper ticket.
"I'm sure that garage overcharged me. Yes, look, it's 3 shillings a gallon."
"It went up this month. It's dreadfully expensive now."
"I'll have to cut your housekeeping," he said wickedly.
"Don't tease me, Abel," Peggy said, mystified. "You spoke of increasing your income just now. What are you thinking of investing in this time?" Abel grinned and winked.
"Now, wouldn't you like to know, Peggy Ronoscki? I'm going to keep you in the dark a bit longer, hun, because I'm not sure. I've been invited to invest in 2 different projects. I could do one or both, or just hold my fire for the time being. At the moment, I'm not sure which would be best for us."
"Are you sorry we sold the cafe?" Their little business on the Devonshire coast had been a small gold mine, and Abel had saved a fair bit of money while they were there.
"Not one bit," Abel said. "The rent from my house is enough, combined with what we earn here, to keep us going for the moment, Peggy. I just want to be certain that when I do invest our savings, I put the money where it will do us the most good."
Peggy nodded and kissed him. He never complained, but she sometimes felt guilty for bringing him back from their life down there, because in some ways it had been better for them all, and yet Faye had wanted to come to London, and Sheila had needed her to be around while she was expecting her 2nd child. "I'm sure the boarding house will pay, Abel," she told him. It was only breaking even at the moment, because not all the rooms were filled, and she'd let one to Alice for barely enough to cover her food. "We'll make a good profit when the rooms are all occupied."
"I know," Abel said and smiled. "You worry too much, Peggy. By Christmas we shall have them queuing up, and every one of them will be begging you to cook them dinner as well as breakfast."
"It gives me time to work in the cake shop," Peggy reminded him. "I'm not sure how that will pay, but we'll see." Abel nodded thoughtfully.
"If you've got enough sugar when you're jam making, why not make a few jars to sell in the shop? Maybe you should give it a go, hun. It won't affect Maureen's trade, and it might show us whether we could diversify a bit."
Peggy didn't bother to remind him of all the difficulty of finding enough of the necessary ingredients. She was curious herself as to whether things like that would sell, and it didn't take much to make another batch while she was at it. She could see what kind of fruit was available and experiment with flavours. "All right, I'll try," she said to please him. "What shall I put on the label?" Abel's eyes narrowed.
"You could put Peggy's apple jam, or Peggy's marmalade," he said, "or Peggy of Mulberry Lane."
A smile lit his face.
"I'll design a label for you. Get the children to help. We'll call it Peggy's of Mulberry Lane, and then whatever flavor it is underneath."
"All right." Peggy laughed, because the idea appealed. It was a bit of fun, and she enjoyed making jam and marmalade just as she enjoyed cooking her apple pies and her cakes. She had several specials that she did particularly well, and she'd noticed that they were selling out first every day. Maureen and Sheila's cakes sold too, but Peggy's own was always the first to go. "Yes, I like that, Abel. Peggy's of Mulberry Lane."
"So do I," Abel said. "It just sounds right."
"I'll have to ask Sheila and Maureen if it is all right, though."
"Yes, of course. But you know what they will say." He winked at her. "Tell Freddie not to forget that England and America are playing in the World Cup this week."
"As if he'd forget."
"As if either of you would forget something like that."
Peggy smiled as he left. Her husband and son were both football fans and would be sure to have the radio on for news of the exciting match. Chapter 4. Peggy was returning from the market with her basket full of fruits and her head teeming with ideas when she suddenly saw the young girl. She looked to be no more than about 15, slight, dark-haired and pretty, but so pale and unsteady that she knew instinctively that she was going to fall. Sprinting towards her, She let the basket drop to the ground and moved to catch the girl even as she crumbled into a heap, murmuring something as her senses left her. "Poor little urchin," a voice Peggy knew well said from behind her. "Let me take her, Peggy." Tom Barton swept the fragile child into his arms as others gathered round to watch. Peggy bent to pick up her basket and the fruit that had fallen from it, making up her mind without a moment's hesitation. "Can you carry her back to mine, Tom?" She smiled as she saw the answer in his face. Tom was one of her favourite people, and she was pleased he'd seen what was going on and come to help. Others might have done so, but she trusted her friend to be kind and thoughtful. "She'll need a doctor by the look of her," Tom said as they walked back from the market to their homes in Mulberry Lane. "I think it's probably just lack of food and tiredness, but she needs to be checked over just in case." "She can go in the little single room I only let if everything else has been taken," Peggy said. "If the doctor wants to send her to hospital, he will, but I think what she needs is a little love and care." "It was lucky for her you were there then," Tom said, giving her a smile of approval. "I'd have taken her back to my Rose at normal times, but she's struggling a bit just now." "Yes, I know." Peggy shot an anxious look at his face. "She isn't really ill, is she?" "I don't think so," Tom replied. "But you know Rose. She's stubborn. I've advised her to ask the doctor to call, but she says she's fine, just feeling a bit like a whale on a beach." Peggy laughed. "That is exactly how I felt when I had the twins. Oh dear, you might suddenly double your family, Tom." "That wouldn't bother me, as long as Rose is all right," he said. "I like having kids about, but I shall need to get a bit of help for Rose until she's on her feet again anyway." "Yes," Peggy agreed and glanced at the girl in Tom's arms. She'd just moaned and her eyelids had fluttered, but she didn't open her eyes. "Rose deserves looking after, Tom, and I know you will." They had reached Mulberry Lane, and one or two heads turned to watch as Tom carried his slender burden inside Peggy's boarding house.